What if I told you that the most feared weapon in the entire Afghan war wasn't a drone, wasn't a missile, wasn't even American? Picture this: 3 beat-up trucks with no doors, no armor, no roof. Just bearded maniacs mounting 50 caliber machine guns, tearing across Taliban positions at speeds that would make your head spin. The enemy called them ghost trucks. American Navy SEALs watched in absolute disbelief. And the men driving them? They were operating under rules that would get anyone else court-martialed. This is the story the military establishment doesn't want you hearing. We're talking about Australian SASR operators who took logistics vehicles from the 1980s and turned them into rolling nightmares that made hardened Taliban commanders shake when they heard the engines coming, while American forces rolled around in 20-ton armored beasts. These Aussies stripped everything off their Land Rovers and drove straight into ambushes that had pinned down entire companies. No backup. No air support, just raw aggression and a death wish that somehow kept them alive. But here's where it gets really disturbing. The Americans couldn't understand what they were seeing. How were 12 men in 3 trucks breaking assaults by 400 insurgents? Why did the Taliban fear these vehicles more than airstrikes? And what exactly happened to the operators who spent a decade driving these machines through the deadliest valleys in Afghanistan? Because the legend you've heard? That's only half the story. The other half involves psychological costs nobody calculated, tactics that crossed lines nobody wants to talk about, and a selection process so brutal it produced warriors who couldn't turn off when they came home. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will completely rewrite everything you thought you knew about modern warfare. The Battle of Kora, the Shah-e-Kot Valley, operations that shocked even Delta Force, and the dark price paid by the men who proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one with the most armor. It's the one driven by operators who simply refuse to stop. This is the untold story of the SASR Perentie. And trust me, you've never heard anything like this before. The American Special Forces operator couldn't believe what he was seeing through his thermal scope that freezing October night in 2006. 3 battered Land Rover Perenties were tearing across the Helmand Province ridgeline at speeds that would make a NASCAR driver nervous, their open frame silhouetted against the moonlit Afghan peaks like something out of a post-apocalyptic fever dream. No armor plating, no doors, no roof, just raw steel, massive machine guns, and bearded men who looked like they'd crawled out of a Mad Max film after a 3-week bender in the desert. The American had been briefed about the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, sure, but nothing prepares you for the moment you realize that everything you learned about modern warfare is about to be rewritten by a bunch of lunatics in pickup trucks. The Perentie 6x6 wasn't supposed to be a frontline assault vehicle. Designed in the 1980s by Land Rover for the Australian Defence Force, these machines were originally meant for logistics and reconnaissance, hauling supplies across the outback, ferrying wounded soldiers, maybe doing some light patrol work in relatively safe zones. But the SASR operators who rolled into Afghanistan in late 2001 took one look at the American MRAPs and Humvees and decided that armor was for people who planned to get hit. But what happened next would change everything the Americans thought they knew about vehicle warfare. Within months of their first deployment, SASR mechanics were stripping everything non-essential off the Perenties. Doors came off, roofs disappeared, windshields were cut down to mere suggestions of glass. What remained was essentially a skeletal frame on massive tires, mounting points for Mark 19 automatic grenade launchers and Browning 50 caliber machine guns, and enough fuel capacity to run for days without resupply. The transformation wasn't just mechanical, it was philosophical, and the Taliban were about to learn this lesson in the most brutal way possible. The Americans watching from their forward operating base in Kandahar that first winter couldn't understand why these Australians seemed so casual about exposing themselves to enemy fire. The answer lay in a tactical philosophy that predated Afghanistan by decades. The SASR had cut their teeth in Vietnam, where the Australian SAS squadrons operated in ways that made even the American Special Forces nervous. They'd perfected the art of the fighting patrol, living in the jungle for weeks at a time, moving silently through enemy territory with a level of bushcraft that seemed almost supernatural. When the War on Terror kicked off, the SASR simply adapted those jungle tactics to the Afghan mountains, and the Perentie became their iron horse. Yet the first major test would reveal something far more disturbing than mere tactical innovation. The first major test of this Mad Max approach came in March 2002 during Operation Anaconda in the Shah-e-Kot Valley. American and coalition forces were hunting Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters who'd retreated into the brutal mountain terrain near Gardez. The plan called for a classic hammer and anvil assault. American troops would push from the valley floor while special operations teams sealed off escape routes in the high peaks. But the Taliban had other ideas, and within hours of the operation's launch, multiple American units found themselves pinned down by withering machine gun and RPG fire from fortified positions in the ridgelines. The radio traffic was chaotic. Calls for air support, medevac requests, units reporting they were taking casualties and couldn't maneuver. The conventional wisdom said you needed heavy armor and overwhelming firepower to crack those mountain positions. The SASR team attached to the operation had been holding back, watching from a neighboring valley as the American plan started to unravel. Their troop commander, a grizzled warrant officer who'd done multiple tours in East Timor, made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed in any other military. What followed was something straight out of a fever dream. Instead of waiting for orders or coordinating with the American chain of command, he simply told his drivers to mount up and his gunners to load armor-piercing rounds. Then they drove straight at the Taliban positions at 70 kilometers per hour across terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. The American forward observer watching through binoculars later described it as watching a cavalry charge, except the horses were diesel-powered and the sabers were belt-fed automatic weapons. The Taliban fighters, who'd successfully pinned down an entire American company, suddenly found themselves facing something they had no training to counter. The Perenties didn't slow down as they approached the Taliban firing positions. If anything, they accelerated, using the rough terrain and massive suspension travel to literally bounce over obstacles that would have stopped an MRAP cold. The Taliban fighters, who'd been trained to fear American airstrikes and artillery, had no mental framework for dealing with vehicles that simply refused to stop or take cover. The SASR gunners opened up with their 50 cals and Mark 19s while still moving at full speed, turning the mountainside into a curtain of high-explosive rounds and armor-piercing bullets. By the time the Perenties reached the Taliban trenches, half the enemy fighters were already fleeing or deceased, and the Australians dismounted to clear the remaining positions with brutal efficiency. But this was only the beginning of a pattern that would haunt the Taliban for over a decade. The American units who'd been pinned down for hours suddenly found the pressure lifted. The radio chatter shifted from panic to confusion. Who were these guys, and how did they just drive through an ambush that had stopped an entire company? When the after-action reports were filed, the American commanders struggled to explain what had happened in conventional military terms. The SASR hadn't followed doctrine. hadn't coordinated their assault through proper channels, hadn't even bothered to call in air support first. They'd just identified the problem and solved it with speed, aggression, and a complete disregard for their own safety. The American Special Forces operator who'd watched it all go down through his thermal scope put it more simply in his journal that night. These Aussie bastards are either the bravest or the craziest sons of bitches I've ever seen, and I honestly can't tell which. Over the next 9 years, the SASR would rotate through Afghanistan 27 times, and with each deployment, their tactics became more refined and more terrifying. The Perentie became synonymous with Australian operations in Uruzgan and Helmand provinces. The Taliban started calling them the ghost trucks because they would appear out of nowhere, wreak havoc, and disappear before conventional forces could even respond. Yet beneath the legend being built, something darker was taking root in the regiment. The vehicles themselves took on personalities, covered in dust and blood, festooned with captured Taliban weapons and flags, rolling through villages like something out of a warrior culture that predated modern warfare by centuries. The key to understanding the SASR's vehicle tactics lies in understanding their selection process and training philosophy. Getting into the Australian Special Air Service isn't just difficult, it's designed to break you psychologically before it even tests you physically. The selection course runs for 21 days in the unforgiving terrain of Western Australia, and the attrition rate hovers around 90%. Here's what separates SASR selection from American Special Forces or even British SAS. There's no camaraderie, no team building, no buddy system. You're alone in the bush with a compass, a map, and a rucksack that weighs 50 kilograms, and you're expected to navigate hundreds of kilometers while the instructors actively try to break your mind. They'll give you contradictory orders, wake you up after 30 minutes of sleep to change your mission, make you think you've failed when you're actually succeeding. The men who pass this course aren't just physically tough, they're psychologically bulletproof, capable of making life or death decisions under extreme stress without needing validation or support from command. And this psychological conditioning would prove essential for what came next. This selection philosophy translated directly into their Afghanistan tactics. When an SASR patrol commander made the decision to drive into an ambush, he wasn't being reckless. He'd already run the calculations in his head, assessed the risks, and determined that speed and aggression gave him better odds than calling for backup and waiting. The Americans, for all their technological superiority and training, operated within a military culture that emphasized coordination, communication, and risk mitigation. The SASR operated within a culture that emphasized individual initiative, calculated aggression, and accepting casualties as the price of victory. The Perentie itself became a symbol of this philosophical divide. American military vehicles in Afghanistan were designed to protect their occupants from IEDs, ambushes, and small arms fire. The MRAP weighed over 20 tons, could withstand massive explosions, and featured advanced communication systems, climate control, and enough armor to stop a .50 caliber round. But all that protection came at a cost. The vehicles were slow, consumed fuel at an alarming rate, and their weight meant they got stuck in soft sand or mud with depressing regularity. But the real difference went far deeper than engineering specifications. The armor created a psychological barrier between the soldiers inside and the environment outside. You couldn't hear the wind, couldn't smell the air, couldn't feel the temperature change. You were sealed in a metal box, relying on cameras and sensors to tell you what was happening in the world beyond your armor plating. The SASR Perentie offered none of these comforts and all of these vulnerabilities. Sitting in the back of an open-top 6x6 as it bounced across the Afghan landscape, you were exposed to everything. The sun that could cook you alive during the day, the cold that could freeze you at night, the dust that got into every piece of gear, every weapon, every exposed pore of your skin. Yet this apparent weakness concealed the deadliest advantage of all. You could see everything, hear everything, smell everything. You knew when a village was occupied because you could smell the cooking fires. You knew when you were approaching an ambush because the birds would stop singing. You knew exactly how your vehicle was handling the terrain because you could feel every bump, every slide, every moment when the tires lost traction. The Perentie didn't protect you from the environment. It made you part of it, and that integration would prove decisive in the battles to come. The tactical philosophy reached its apex during the Battle of Kora in June 2007. A combined Dutch and Australian force was defending the small town of Chora in Uruzgan province against a massive Taliban assault. Intelligence estimated between 250 and 400 insurgents were converging on the town, equipped with heavy weapons, mortars, and the kind of fanatical determination that comes from believing you're on a holy mission. The Dutch troops, fighting from fortified positions in the town center, were quickly being overwhelmed. The Taliban were using classic insurgent tactics, infiltrating through orchards and irrigation ditches, using civilian compounds for cover, advancing under the cover of mortar fire. The conventional military response would have been to call in airstrikes, establish a defensive perimeter, and wait for reinforcements. But the SASR team in the area had other ideas, and those ideas would create a legend that Taliban fighters still whisper about today. 3 Perenties loaded with 12 SASR operators and their Afghan interpreters rolled out of their patrol base at dawn on June 16th. Their mission brief was simple: break the Taliban assault before the Dutch position collapsed. The Taliban had established multiple fighting positions in the green zone around Kora, the fertile agricultural belt where vegetation provided perfect cover for ambushes. Any normal military unit would have approached cautiously, using dismounted infantry to clear each compound methodically. The SASR drove straight down the main road at full speed, their gunners engaging Taliban positions while the vehicles were still moving. When they hit resistance too heavy to punch through, they'd peel off into the fields, using the Perentie's massive ground clearance to drive over irrigation ditches and through orchards that would have bottled up any other vehicle. For 7 hours, those 3 vehicles created chaos across the battlefield. The Americans monitoring the battle from their operations center in Kandahar couldn't believe what they were witnessing. The Taliban couldn't establish firing positions because the Perenties would appear from unexpected angles, hammer them with .50 caliber and automatic grenade fire, then disappear before the insurgents could coordinate a response. The Americans monitoring the battle from their operations center in Kandahar couldn't understand what they were seeing on their aerial feeds. The standard symbology for friendly vehicles showed 3 icons moving at speeds and through terrain that shouldn't have been possible. One Air Force combat controller, watching the feed while coordinating close air support, reportedly said that watching the SASR operate was like watching a shark hunt: smooth, efficient, and absolutely terrifying if you were the prey. The turning point came when the Taliban tried to maneuver a heavy machine gun team onto the high ground overlooking the Dutch positions. If they'd succeeded, they could have poured enfilade fire into the town and likely broken the defense. The SASR troop commander spotted the movement and made an instant decision. Instead of calling for an airstrike, which would take minutes to coordinate and execute, he ordered his driver to take the most direct route to the high ground. That route happened to be up a near-vertical goat path that wasn't designed for vehicles. What happened next defied every principle of vehicle warfare taught in military academies. The Perentie made it halfway up before the angle became too steep and the rear wheels lost traction. The SASR operators simply dismounted, sprinted the remaining 50 meters to the Taliban position, and cleared it with small arms fire in less than 90 seconds. The machine gun team never got off a shot. By nightfall on June 16th, the Taliban assault had collapsed. Estimates of insurgent casualties ranged from 70 to over 100 fighters eliminated or wounded, with minimal coalition losses. The Dutch troops who'd been fighting for their lives that morning were stunned when they realized that 12 Australian operators in 3 stripped-down trucks had broken an assault by an insurgent force 20 times their size. But the real impact of the battle wasn't measured in body counts or tactical victories. It was measured in the psychological effect on the Taliban. Within days, intercepted radio traffic from insurgent commanders included specific warnings about the Australian vehicles. They called them devil trucks, ghost riders, the bearded ones who cannot be stopped. Yet this reign of terror came at a price the public would only discover years later. The fear was palpable, and it was strategic. The Taliban started avoiding areas where they knew the SASR was operating, which meant entire regions became temporarily pacified, not through occupation, but through reputation. But this operational tempo and tactical aggression came with costs that wouldn't become fully apparent until the war ended. The SASR rotations through Afghanistan were brutal by any standard. 4 to 6 month deployments where operators would spend weeks at a time living in their vehicles or in temporary patrol bases, conducting operations almost nightly, accumulating a kind of exhaustion that goes beyond physical tiredness into something more existential. The Australian military called it operational fatigue, but the operators themselves had different terms for it. The 1,000-yard stare was common enough, but there was something deeper happening to men who'd done 5, 7, 10 rotations through Afghanistan. They stopped talking as much, stopped showing emotion, started making decisions with a cold efficiency that bordered on mechanical. The open-top Perenties accelerated this psychological toll in ways that armored vehicles didn't, and the toll was far more severe than anyone admitted at the time. When you're sealed inside an MRAP, you're insulated from the immediate sensory overload of combat. The armor deadens the sound of incoming fire, the climate control keeps you comfortable, the enclosed space creates a psychological bubble. But sitting exposed in a Perentie, you experienced every moment of combat in full sensory detail. The crack of bullets passing overhead, the concussive blast of RPGs impacting nearby, the smell of burned propellant and blood, the sight of enemy fighters being torn apart by 50 caliber rounds at close range. There was no buffer, no distance, no way to compartmentalize. Some operators thrived in this environment. Their nervous systems somehow capable of processing extreme violence without breaking. Others accumulated trauma like scar tissue, functional in combat but increasingly disconnected from normal human emotion. The American Special Operations community watched this evolution with a mixture of admiration and concern. Navy SEAL teams who'd worked alongside the SASR in Helmand Province came back with stories that bordered on mythological. Australians who'd clear compounds with their bare hands rather than waste ammunition. Operators who seemed to navigate the Afghan terrain by instinct rather than GPS. Entire SASR troops that moved through enemy territory like ghosts, leaving behind demolished Taliban positions and no witnesses. But there were also darker stories that wouldn't surface until years after the war ended. Whispered conversations about operators who'd stopped taking prisoners, about compounds cleared with an efficiency that suggested rules of engagement were being interpreted very flexibly, about Afghan civilians who claimed the bearded Australians were more frightening than the Taliban themselves. The vehicle culture itself became part of this transformation. Each Perentie developed a personality, a history, a reputation. Operators would paint kill marks on the frames, mount captured Taliban weapons as trophies, personalize their vehicles with modifications that would never pass a safety inspection. One particularly infamous Perentie, nicknamed Bertha by its crew, had been through 11 major contacts, survived 3 IED strikes, and accumulated so many bullet holes in its body panels that the armorer stopped counting. The vehicle became a legend within the SASR. New operators were told Bertha was unkillable, that Taliban bullets somehow swerved around it, that riding in Bertha meant you were protected by something beyond mere luck. This kind of magical thinking is common in combat units, but it also reflected a deeper psychological need. These men were operating in vehicles that offered zero physical protection, so they created narratives of supernatural protection to fill the void. Yet the mythology couldn't hide the fundamental brutality of what they were doing. The tactical effectiveness of the Perentie strategy was undeniable, but it rested on several factors that couldn't be easily replicated by other military units. First, the SASR's small size meant they could maintain the kind of selective personnel standards that would be impossible in a larger force. Every operator had passed one of the world's most brutal selection courses, had proven themselves across multiple deployments, and had internalized the regiment's culture of aggressive independence. Second, the SASR operated with a level of command autonomy that American special operations units envied. Patrol commanders could make tactical decisions without clearing them up the chain of command, as long as they achieved results. This decentralized decision-making meant that SASR teams could exploit opportunities that would have been missed in a more bureaucratic military structure. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the SASR had accepted a fundamental truth that other militaries struggled with. In counterinsurgency warfare, sometimes the appearance of invincibility matters more than actual invincibility. And this psychological warfare reached levels that crossed into pure intimidation. The Perentie looked insane, looked vulnerable, looked like it shouldn't work. But that apparent vulnerability was part of the psychological operation. Taliban fighters who saw these open-top trucks coming didn't think the Australians are crazy to drive vehicles like that. They thought the Australians must be so dangerous, so skilled, so confident that they don't even need armor. The perception became reality. And the reality was that Taliban units would often break and run at the first sign of SASR vehicles rather than stand and fight. American Special Operations began incorporating elements of the SASR vehicle doctrine around 2008. SEAL teams in Afghanistan started requesting lighter, more maneuverable vehicles for their operations. Army Special Forces units began training with stripped-down Humvees, removing some armor to increase speed and fuel efficiency. The Marine Special Operations Command experimented with all-terrain vehicles for rapid assault missions, but the cultural shift was incomplete. The American military-industrial complex was built around protection and technology, and there was institutional resistance to the idea that sometimes less armor meant more safety. The few American units that fully embraced the SASR philosophy tended to be small, elite teams that operated in remote regions where conventional backup wasn't available anyway. The real measure of the Perentie's impact came from the enemy. Taliban commanders captured during operations in Uruzgan and Helmand provinces consistently identified the Australian vehicles as a primary threat, more feared than American airstrikes or artillery. The reasoning was brutally pragmatic. You could hide from airstrikes in tunnels. You could scatter when you heard artillery incoming. but the SASR in their Perentes would hunt you across the mountains and valleys until they found you. Yet what the Taliban feared most wasn't the vehicles themselves, it was what they represented. The vehicles became a symbol of relentless pursuit, of an enemy that wouldn't stop, wouldn't slow down, wouldn't accept defeat. One captured Taliban logistics coordinator, when asked during interrogation what weapons he feared most, didn't mention drones or helicopters. He mentioned the Australian trucks with no doors and the men with long beards who drove them. His voice reportedly shook when he described them, and the interrogators noted that he seemed more afraid of the memory than of his current captivity. By 2010, the SASR vehicle tactics had been refined to a lethal science. New modifications appeared on the Perentes, improved suspension components that allowed even more aggressive off-road driving, upgraded engine management systems that squeezed more horsepower from the diesel power plants, custom fabricated weapon mounts that allowed gunners to engage targets in any direction without the vehicle stopping. The regiment's mechanics became legends in their own right, capable of keeping these brutally abused machines running under conditions that would destroy civilian vehicles in days. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but repeated by multiple sources, of a Perentie that took an RPG hit to the engine block during a firefight in Helmand. The engine seized. The vehicle was technically destroyed, but the crew managed to coast down a hill, engage the Taliban position with their vehicle-mounted weapons, and then extract on foot, all while under fire. The vehicle was recovered 3 days later and had its engine replaced. It was back in action within a week, as if the machine itself had absorbed the regiment's refusal to quit. But the sustainability of this operational pace became a serious concern for Australian Defence Force leadership by 2011. The SASR had been operating at wartime tempo for nearly a decade, with some operators completing 15 or more rotations through Afghanistan. The physical toll was obvious. Chronic injuries from the constant vehicle operations, hearing damage from years of exposure to unsuppressed weapons fire, the general deterioration that comes from operating in harsh environments with minimal rest. But the psychological toll was harder to measure and potentially more serious. The regiment had lost men to combat, but it was losing even more to consequences that came after they returned home. The same psychological resilience that made these men so effective in combat made them exceptionally skilled at hiding their internal struggles until it was too late. The vehicle culture itself became a coping mechanism, a way to maintain identity and purpose during the chaos of repeated deployments. Operators would return to Australia for their mandatory post-deployment leave, but many of them struggled with civilian life in ways that their American counterparts didn't. The American military had built an entire infrastructure around veteran support, transition programs, mental health resources. Australia's smaller military meant fewer resources and less specialized support for operators coming back from extreme deployments. Some SASR operators found themselves more comfortable with the vehicles and the missions than with the peaceful suburbs of Perth or Sydney. The Perentie became home in a way that their actual homes couldn't be. It was familiar. It made sense. It had a purpose. When that purpose was taken away, many operators found themselves adrift. The tactical lessons from the SASR's vehicle operations in Afghanistan spread through the international special operations community like wildfire. British SAS squadrons, already culturally close to their Australian counterparts, began pushing for lighter vehicle options. Canadian Joint Task Force 2 operators who'd worked alongside the SASR came back advocating for more aggressive mobility tactics. Even Russian Spetsnaz units, analyzing coalition operations in Afghanistan, reportedly concluded that the Australian approach to mobility warfare had been more effective than the American reliance on armor and firepower. The Perentie itself became a case study in military academies around the world. Here was a vehicle designed in the 1980s for logistics support, transformed by operator ingenuity and institutional culture into one of the most effective counterinsurgency platforms of the 21st century. Staff officers studied the modifications, the tactics, the operational results. But few of them studied the human cost, the psychological price paid by the men who made those tactics work. As the Australian commitment to Afghanistan wound down toward 2013, questions began emerging about the price of this effectiveness. The regiment had achieved remarkable tactical successes, had earned the respect of allies and the fear of enemies, had proven that aggressive mobility could overcome technological disadvantages. But at what cost? The operators who'd spent a decade driving these vehicles through the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan, who'd survived ambushes and firefights that should have ended them, who'd become legends within the special operations community, many of them were psychologically shattered by the experience. The same brutal selection process that created warriors capable of driving into ambushes without hesitation also created men who struggled to turn off that aggression when they came home. The legacy of the Perentie in Afghanistan is ultimately a story about trade-offs. The SASR chose speed over protection, aggression over caution, individual initiative over institutional control. These choices produced tactical victories that saved lives and terrified the enemy. But they also produced casualties that don't show up on official reports. Marriages destroyed, careers ended by substance abuse, operators who couldn't reintegrate into civilian society, tragedies that never made the news. The American military, for all its bureaucracy and risk aversion, had systems in place to catch soldiers before they fell too far. The SASR's culture of elite independence meant that operators were expected to handle their own problems, and asking for help was seen as weakness. The tactical effectiveness was never in question. Multiple American commanders officially praised the SASR's contributions to operations in southern Afghanistan. The British High Command specifically requested SASR attachments for operations in Helmand Province because they knew these small Australian teams could achieve effects far beyond their numbers. The Afghan National Army soldiers who worked alongside the SASR adopted some of their tactics, particularly the emphasis on mobility and aggressive pursuit of Taliban forces. The statistical record speaks for itself. Over 12 years of operations, the SASR conducted thousands of patrols, hundreds of direct action raids, and achieved results that would make any military force proud. But statistics don't capture the human cost of creating warriors capable of such effectiveness. The Perentie wasn't just a vehicle, it was a mobile embodiment of a philosophy that said protection is an illusion, speed is survival, and aggression solves problems that caution cannot. That philosophy worked brilliantly in the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan. It worked less well in the suburbs and cities of Australia when operators came home. The same men who could drive through ambushes without flinching found themselves paralyzed by the banality of civilian life. The vehicles that had kept them alive through countless firefights were sold off or retired. But the psychological conditioning that came from years of operating in those vehicles didn't retire with them. The final chapter of the Perentie story in Afghanistan came in December 2013, when the last SASR troops rotated out of Uruzgan province. The vehicles that had served so well throughout the war were gradually phased out, replaced by newer platforms that offered better protection and modern electronics. Some of the old war-worn Perenties were shipped back to Australia for display in military museums. Others were stripped for parts or sold to civilian collectors. A few reportedly ended up in the hands of Afghan security forces, where they presumably continued their service in less capable hands. But the legend of these vehicles, and the men who drove them, remained very much alive. Taliban fighters who survived the war still tell stories about the ghost trucks. They describe vehicles that moved like living creatures across the landscape, that appeared from impossible angles, that brought finality with mechanical precision. They remember the bearded men who drove these machines, who seemed immune to fear, who pursued their enemies with a determination that bordered on supernatural. For the Australians who actually drove those Perenties through 12 years of combat operations, the memories are less romantic and more complicated. They remember the effectiveness, yes, but they also remember the friends who didn't come home, the psychological toll of constant exposure to violence, the strange disconnect between the warrior they needed to be in Afghanistan and the civilian they're expected to be at home. The American Special Operations community continues to study the SASR vehicle tactics years after the war ended. Staff colleges analyze the Battle of Kora as a case study in mobile warfare. Special Forces qualification courses include modules on aggressive mobility inspired by Australian operations. Navy SEAL teams still reference the Perentie doctrine when planning operations in austere environments. But there's also a growing acknowledgement that you can't simply copy tactics without understanding the culture that created them. The SASR's effectiveness with light vehicles wasn't just about the machines, it was about the selection process, the training philosophy, the command structure, and ultimately the willingness to accept risks that other militaries consider unacceptable. The psychological profile required to excel in this kind of warfare is specific and rare. You need men who can make instant life or death decisions without freezing, who can function effectively under extreme stress, who can suppress normal human emotions like fear and empathy when the mission requires it. But you also need men who can turn those traits off when they come home, who can reintegrate into civilian society, who can be fathers and husbands and friends after spending months being warriors. The SASR selection process was brilliant at finding the first type of man. The regiment's support systems were less effective at helping those men make the transition back. The Perentie itself has become a symbol in Australian military culture, representing both the brilliance and the cost of the SASR's approach to warfare. Veterans see those vehicles in museums and remember the adrenaline, the brotherhood, the sense of purpose that came from operating at the edge of human capability. Their families see those same vehicles and remember the deployments, the injuries, the changes in personality that came with each rotation. The wider Australian public, largely insulated from the realities of the war in Afghanistan, sees the Perentie as evidence of military prowess, proof that Australia could stand alongside global superpowers and fight on equal terms. All of these perspectives are valid, and all of them miss part of the larger truth. The larger truth is that the 6x6 Perentie, stripped down and weaponized by SASR ingenuity, became one of the most effective counterinsurgency platforms of the Afghan War precisely because it embodied contradictions that the military establishment struggles to reconcile. It was vulnerable, yet survived. Simple, yet devastatingly effective. Old technology deployed with innovative tactics. The men who drove these vehicles into combat were similarly contradictory. Elite operators trained to the highest standards who operated with minimal oversight, aggressive warriors who achieved strategic objectives through violence, and human beings who paid psychological costs that were still calculating years after the war ended. The Perentie's legacy isn't just about tactical innovation or military effectiveness. It's about what we're willing to sacrifice to achieve victory, and whether we're prepared to support the warriors who make those sacrifices on our behalf. The ghost trucks are gone from Afghanistan now, retired or repurposed or sitting in museums, but their impact remains, etched into the tactical doctrine of special operations forces worldwide, carved into the memories of Taliban fighters who survived encounters with them, and burned into the psyches of the Australian operators who proved that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one with the most armor. It's the one driven by men who refuse to accept anything less than total victory, no matter what it costs them personally.